right, so it's time to get started. I graded the second assignment, which is the project proposal one. For if you turn in something that I can at least read, I would have provided some feedback. I would either say, yeah, this is a great idea, or I would suggest something. Just remember, this is also just a first project proposal. So as the semester progresses, we can continue to kind of fine tune it and change it. What I'll do today is, based on what you guys turn in of what you plan to do with your project. So I'm going to use that as a starting point and talk about something that you might need to know in order to implement your project, because many of you wanted to have some sort of tracking. Okay, some people want to track exercise habits. Okay, some people want to track customers, some people want to track locations and whatnot. So in almost every single case, information or data needs to be stored on the device in a persistent way, which means when you shut down the app, when you reboot your phone, you still want to be able to access data back. And then also in most cases, people want to store data that is kind of dynamic in nature. In other words, you cannot just say that I'm going to store like 3 entries. Most people have an app that will have to store a arbitrary number of entries, which can be an issue. But TinyDB can handle it. You just need to learn certain techniques to make use of TinyDB in order to handle those cases. So that's why I wrote a new note here. This is new. It was not there before. Okay, I wrote it just this morning because based on what I have read from your project proposal. So it's called persistent tracking using TinyDB. It's basically just a general topic of how do you handle an arbitrary number of things that you want to track from the application using TinyDB. Okay, so that's that's something that's new. Okay. So first, we want to talk about just global variables and values first, and then we'll move on to lists. We have already some exposure to all of these topics, and then we'll move on to persistent tracking using TinyDB. So we'll start with this particular topic, which is just global variables. So global variables, as the name implies, global means that these variables are visible throughout your entire quote-unquote screen. Okay, I was about to say application, but that would not be right, because variables are specific to each screen. If you have 2 screens in your application, variables do not share across screens. Okay, global variables. So they're global within a screen, but they do not go across screens. So you got to keep that in mind. So even if you declare the same name as global variables across screens, they don't automatically get updated. So you will still need to use the tricks that we talked about the other day to send data to the other screen, and then also to send back data to the originating screen when you're closing a particular screen. So you have to employ those techniques to kind of synchronize variables across screens. It's probably much easier if I just do an app here to show you what a global variable is and how to use one. I mean, we have had certain example programs already related to that. And this is using the wrong account. Let me just sign in using my other account first. Okay, I think it's getting blocked because of Privacy Badger, which otherwise is actually a great tool, great little plugin in Google Chrome, to kind of safeguard your privacy. There we go. I think I was using this account for all the sample programs. All right. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and start a new simple project, to demonstrate, global variables. So I'm just going to name this one as test global. And there's really not a whole lot to say about global variables. What I'll do is I'll have 2 text fields. and when I click a button, it will just copy. Well, no, that's okay. There will be two buttons. One button to copy the content of the text field into a global variable, and then the other one to copy from the global variable to the other text field. So that will basically just kind of show you that global variables, how it works, how to declare one, and to show that yes, within the same screen you can use global variables in different blocks. Doesn't matter where you are. So we'll go ahead and just do exactly that, which is one text box here, one button here, and another button here, and another text box here. Okay. And then what I'll do, I don't even bother to rename the text, on the buttons, because that really is not the whole point of this exercise. The whole point of the exercise is when you click the first button, it's going to copy whatever the first text box has into a global variable. Now this part is important. If you want to declare a global variable, you have to start with initialize global whatever name, and you can leave the initialization to nothing or just make an empty string. It doesn't really matter, but you do need this block here to basically say, yes, I do want to have a global variable with this name. So obviously you want to change name to something that you really want to use. So I'm just going to change this one to variable x, okay, because there's no particular use of this one except for demonstration. And if you leave it uninitialized, it will be reported as a warning. And if you click on the warning symbol here, it says you should fill all of the sockets with blocks. In other words, if you leave a global variable uninitialized, it's just a bad idea. But it doesn't mean that your program is not going to run. Okay, so it all depends on how you want to run your application. And personally, I think we should fix all of the exclamation point, all the warning symbols. So we'll just do something really simple here, give it an empty string, and it doesn't complain anymore. The problem with not fixing something like this particular one is somewhat benign. Okay, it's not going to be a big problem in most cases. But if you have these things, and then you end up with more and more warnings, then what about the other warnings? They can be important. So when you just look at the number of warnings, okay, it's like 5 or 6, okay? But how do you know which one is important and which one is not? This one is not important, but maybe the next one is. So it's a good idea to fix all of the warnings so that when it does pop up, you have to look at it and say, okay, is this important? If it's not, fix it. Just fix it even if it is not important. Okay, so now that we have this global variable, when button 1 is clicked, I want to copy the text from text box 1 into the global variable x. To do that, we have to go to variables and say set something to something else. So in this case, it is a red warning sign, which means this is an error. Okay, your program is not going to run with something like this. So with a drop-down box, you can pick global variable x, and we want to set it to something. Now it turns into a yellow warning sign because we still have to specify what we're going to change it to. So what we're changing it to is based on text box 1. And in fact, it will be the text inside text box 1. So we have to go to this property here and say that whatever text is in text box 1, we want to make variable x the same. Are there any questions about this program up to this point? So you type something into text box 1, you click that first button, and it will just copy that into the global variable x. And then after that, we'll have a button 2 to do something that is basically opposite of what we just did. When button 2 is clicked, then we'll go ahead and set the text of text box 2 to global variable x. So this time it's the reverse. So what you need to do is to go to text box 2 and then say, I want to set the text of text box 2 to something. What it is the content or the value of global variable x. To refer to the value of a global variable, you have to use a get block. So now you just drag and drop the get blocks and then specify that we want to get the value of global variable x. So this is the entire program to demonstrate how to make use of a global variable. So you declare using the initialize block, you change it using the set block, and then you refer to it using the get block. Those are the 3 blocks related to global variables. So now that this part is done, we can go ahead and test this program. This is a really, really easy program to test. So we can just go ahead and start up the AI starter and go back to the browser and say start or initialize the emulator. And wait a little bit. I forgot to bring my row sheet folder today, so I'm not taking row today. But instead, I'm going to use logging in, as a sign that you're here. So just go ahead and use your browser to sign in to Moodle, and I'm going to use that to take row. Which I think is not a bad way to do it, since most of you are following me, on Moodle anyway. All right, it's getting there. And then some of the project proposals, also involved, possibly using, some web resources, to store data and to retrieve data. So those are a little bit more complicated. We will get to that eventually, but this is the starting point. Right, so companion is running, it's getting the blocks, getting initialized. There we go, we have the app up and running. So what we'll do is we'll just say, okay, this is a test, okay? So the first text box, says, this is a test. I click the first button here, which should have copied the content of the text box into global variable X. Now, just to be sure that we are not copying the text, from somewhere else, I'm going to delete everything here. And then I click the second button here, and even if the text box, even the text of text box 1 is all gone, clicking the second button should still copy the content because the content is now also in global variable X. Okay, so this would be a good test, and it did. Okay, so you can see that it copied the content, of global variable X to the second text box. So this is a quick and easy demonstration to show you how global variables work. Are there any questions? Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious about if you want to do some math. If you want to do something like a Pythagorean theorem, you want them to input an x value or something, and then you wanted to hit a button and have it do a calculation.
Okay, we can go ahead and modify this, for that purpose. Okay, so there are several ways to do that. So if I go back to the designer, the first thing is, I'm going to change the ordering of these things here. So let me see if I can just move this up. Okay, so instead of text for button 1, text for button 2, maybe I'll just go ahead and calculate the value of something and put it into the label. Okay, so maybe the first one is just calculating the sum, second one calculates the product. Okay, so we'll go ahead and change the program a little bit to reflect what we want to do here. So we go back to blocks here, and global variable is no longer needed actually in this case. I don't need a global variable because I'm looking at the value of each text box, as they are on screen. So we'll go ahead and remove this, and this does not need to be there anymore. And this one I can kind of keep, but I have to throw away the other side here. All right, so button 1 is going to set, the text of label 1 to something. So now I go to label 1 and then say set its text to the following. And then with this one, even though it says text box 2 right now, I can actually, oh, okay, it doesn't let me do that. So I still need to change that. So we'll go ahead and duplicate this block and stash it here. All right. So what we want to do with this little notch here is to specify the addition or the sum of the two numbers, one in text box 1 and one in text box 2. Okay. To do that, you have to go to math, and it's really tedious when you want to enter an equation because you have to go through these blocks to do it. So with the other one, it would be multiplication. So here we have multiplication and stash it over here. And if you click this little icon here, it will show you, you can actually make it so you can add 3 items if you want to. Otherwise, you have to nest an addition inside another addition, which is serving exactly the same purpose. It's just kind of more cumbersome. So if you want to, you can add multiple items like this. Okay. All right. So the next question is, what do we put into here? You can, if you want to, go to text box 1 and just grab its text content and stash it into here, and then go to text box 2 and stash its content over here. So we'll go ahead and do it this way, and I'll show you why it may not be a good idea. Okay. So we'll go ahead and duplicate this block here and put it here, and duplicate this block and put it over here. Okay. So now we got the whole quote-unquote program done. If I click on the first button, it will calculate the sum of the 2 numbers in the text boxes and show it in the label. If I click the second button, it will calculate the product and show it in the label. Okay, so we'll go ahead and run the program, which is already updated at this point, and we'll do it and check it and see if it works. So I click on text box 1 and say this is 12, and then click on text box 2 and say this is, let's say, 5. So the sum should be 17, and it shows 17 right here, and then the product is 60, and it shows 60 over here. But it has a potential problem, because what if I enter something like this? Instead of 12, I spell out 12, T-W-E-L-V-E. Okay, that's not going to work, because it is spelled out as a word, and a word does not convert into a numeric value automatically. But the problem is, it's not something that your program is catching, or at least this program is not catching it. So when I click this button, it shows it's actually a runtime error. And it says, the plus operator cannot accept the argument 12, 5, 12 is the problem one, because it is not a number. So if you don't want your program to quote-unquote crash, because of something like this, then you have to do some other thing, like, testing, to see if a text box is actually a number or not. Or you can go back to the designer screen and specify that a text box can only contain numbers. That's another option, is to limit what you can put into a text box. So you can go back to designer, go to text box 1, go to its properties, and change numbers only, and make sure that is checked. So this way I cannot possibly enter something that is non-text once I have numbers only checked. Is that okay so far? Yep, go ahead.
So now that you have that checked, if you ran it again and typed in 12, will it tell you?
It won't, I cannot even type T.
Okay.
Yeah. It just won't take it. It can only take digits in the decimal point. Now, whether it can make sure that you can only have 1 decimal point or not, that I'm not sure. So you got my curiosity here. So we'll go ahead and see whether it will do that. And the app should be updated automatically already. So we'll go here and type in 12. You can see that even the keyboard is different. It doesn't show the regular keyboard anymore. It only shows the numbers, or the alternate keyboard with only the numbers. So we want to enter like I can always switch it back. Nope, it doesn't let me switch back, but I cannot type anything. I can click all I want, but it doesn't show in the text box.
Just figure out that.
Right. But the next question is, if I enter 12.25, can I enter another point here? And the answer is no. So it does all the usual checking for numbers, and it works out pretty good then. Yeah. Okay, so are there any questions about this particular application? I can still break this program, by the way, because the second one has nothing yet. So if I click in here, it's still going to have a problem. It says the operation plus cannot. Oh, come on, show me. It showed the error once, but then it doesn't show anymore. Okay, there's an empty string for the second one. So there is a way for you to do error checking if you want to. Okay, so to do error checking, what you want to do is to go to math here, and there's a way to convert is a number. So you basically click is a number, use that to check whether you have a valid number or not before you use it for processing. If it is not a real number, then you stop the operation and say, okay, you got to give me some actual numbers to process, and I'm not going to do anything until you give me actual numbers. So that's one really cool way to do it. And there's a conversion too from a string to a number. And I'm trying to find that function. It should be under text. I'm gonna do a quick search here. Nope. It's automatic. So the same thing can be a number or can be looked at as a string. So you have to rely on math and use this block is a number to double check whether something is a number or not before you use it as if it is a number. All right. So are there any questions at this point about doing calculations? It does get very tedious. Okay, getting back to your original question. If you have a complicated equation, it gets tedious because you cannot just type something. You have to drag and drop all the blocks. But at the same time, there's no need to use parentheses because the nesting of the blocks already imply the order of operation. So there's no need to use parentheses, in App Inventor. So that's kind of the nice thing, but there will be a lot of dragging and dropping. Okay. All right. So any other questions at this point about global variables? Now there are really three different types of values in App Inventor. Okay, there are three kind of stuff that you can store in a variable. The first one is a string, okay, which is something that you type in the text box. It can be a name, can be an address, can be the name of a city, a state, and so on. The other one is a number. I just kind of showed you what a number is. And then the third one is a list. Okay, a list is like a folder. If you look at a number or string as a regular file, then a list is like a folder, which can be used to contain other things, which is really, really helpful because not only can you contain numbers and strings within the list, you can have also other lists inside a particular list. In other words, it's just like with folders. You can have a folder that has subfolders, and then each subfolder has sub-subfolders, and so on. So that really helps you organize things. And from the top level perspective, it is one single folder. It's just that when you open that folder, you have two subfolders and 5 files. And then if you open a sub-subfolder, you have some additional files and some additional sub-subfolders, and so on. Okay, so that's really helpful. When we get to lists, you will see how useful that particular feature is. All right, so getting back to global variables. So in general, variables in App Inventor are not statically typed. In other words, sometimes you can store a list into a variable, and other times you can store a number, and yet some other times you can store a string. It does not restrict a particular variable to a certain type. Instead, whatever you put into a variable is dynamic. At runtime, you can change what kind of value you want to store in a variable. All right. So types of values and operations. What this really is saying is, depending on the value stored in a variable, some operations may not work sometimes. It's just like earlier when we tried to specify 12TWELVE as one of the numbers to perform the addition or the multiplication. That didn't work. Okay, that has to do with the plus operator expecting 2 numbers or the multiplication operator expecting 2 numbers. So for certain operations, what you're actually storing in a variable at the time when the operator is effective is important. So it's always helpful if you suspect that a variable may not have what you want in the variable because somebody has to type it in or it's read from a file. It's always useful to check it first. Okay, if it is not of the right kind of value, you just skip over the block and give the end user an error message. And basically just say, okay, this is not what I'm expecting, there's a problem, instead of having the program to crash on the end user, which is worse, okay, because you don't want to have a program that crashes all the time. Are there any questions, about all these topics? Because we are pretty much done with the concept of a global variables in this, of a global variable in this case. So I'm going to leave this one up here, while we move on to the concept of a list. So with the list, the first part you can kind of ignore because that's a note from last year, when App Inventor just updated to version 2, from version 1. So there's a little bit of a discussion here. But in terms of a list, this is a list. Okay. So a list like this, contains, basically at the top level, there are 4 items. The first item at the top level is a number, 23. The second item is tagged as a string. The last item is also a number, 43. But the third item is kind of funky because the third item is a list all by itself. So the third item is a list that consists of 100 as a number and true. You can consider true as a string or a Boolean value. App Inventor really does not make a differentiation between a Boolean versus a string, but true is just interpreted as true. So are there any questions at this point about what is a list, what a list can contain? Questions? Okay. Now, one thing about a list is the ordering of things inside. Each thing inside a list is also called an element, but the ordering is important. So in this case, 23 is the first item, and then tag is the second item. The third item is a list, and then the fourth item is 43. Okay, the positioning of each item is significant. So what do we do with a list? Well, you can do a lot of things with a list. Okay, if you read through the rest of this note here, there's a little application where you can remember the points of a drag operation. So I'm not going to get into that one because it has a lot of stuff that has to do with a canvas, which we haven't really talked about yet at this point. So I'm going to skip that one. Instead, I'm going to show you some, simpler examples of what you can do with a list. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and write a new app, that makes use of a list. So I'm going to stop this app here and make a new app and just say list of numbers. Okay. So with this particular application, list of numbers, we'll have several things that we can do. We'll have one single text box to enter values. Okay, to enter values into a list. We'll have another text box to process, that particular list. So in other words, one will basically be, I'll use one to enter numbers into a list, and we'll make it as long as we need to. Okay, so every time you punch in a number and you say add this number to a list, it will just keep appending or keep adding to the end of a list. And before we do any type of calculations, I'll still show you how to look at the content of a list. Okay, you can actually go, that's pretty easy to do. So we'll go ahead and start with that portion here. So what we'll do is to pick a text box, and in this text box we want to limit to numbers because eventually we want to do something like addition or multiplication with all these numbers. So we'll go ahead and limit these to just numbers only. And then the second item is a button. This time I want to change the name of the button a little bit just so that I remember what this button is for. So the text here is to add number to list. That's all it's going to do, is to add this number to the list that is maintained internally. And press the enter key, so now it is updated. And it's also a good idea to change the name of a component which is invisible to the same, to reflect what the component does. So button 1 is going to be renamed, in this case, to BTN, which is the abbreviation of button, add number to list. You can make it as long as you want, because in App Inventor, you rarely, if any time, have to type the name of a variable because it's all using a drop-down list. So you can use longer names to help you remember what a particular item is for. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to write some code already. So switch to blocks mode here, and start with button add number to list. You always want to start programming using a when block. Okay, so in this case, I also need a global variable to maintain the list of numbers that I'm trying to track. So I'm going to have a global variable, change the name to list of numbers. Okay, and here it is important for you to initialize it to a particular type of value. So I'm going to go to list here and just say that this is an empty list. Okay, it's complaining about. Okay, it's not complaining. I just didn't drop it at the right place. So list of numbers is initially an empty list. An empty list is okay. It's just like an empty folder. Okay, it is a list. There's just no content. There's nothing inside this list. So that's okay. It's perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with an empty list. Whenever this button is clicked, I want to get the current item or to get the current value in the text box and add it to this particular list here, which is list of numbers, which is a global variable. So when it is clicked, then the first thing I want to do is, the only thing I want to do is to go to list here and just say I want to add a particular item to the list. So here we have the ability, okay, if you just hover over it, it will show you the help text here, add items to the end of a list. Okay, in other words, it is appending to the end of a list. If you already have 1, 4, 5 in the list and you're trying to add 6 to it, 6 becomes the last item, not the first one. Okay, it is appending to the end of this list. All right, so we'll drag this one here and specify that our list of numbers is the list that is getting affected, and the item that we're adding is based on the content of the text box. So here I'm not going to be picky and say, well, there has to be a number in the text box before I add it. I'm just going to say, okay, let's assume there's a number there. Okay, I'm just getting a little bit lazy here. And besides, we haven't really talked about the conditional statement, which is what you need in order to test it first before you add it. So I'm going to go to text box 1, grab its value, which is the text property of text box 1, right here, and stash it here. Okay. So right now I have a program that quote unquote works by, it does add items to a list, but there's no way for you to see that things are getting added because there's nothing to retrieve the content of a list. Okay. So that also means the app is not particularly useful right now because we have no idea whether it works or not. So the next thing I want to do is to add a list picker. If you click on the question mark here, it shows you that the list picker is a button that when clicked displays a list of text for the user to choose among. The text can be specified through the designer or blocks editor by setting the elements from string property to the string separated concatenation, or by setting elements property to a list in the blocks editor, which is great because we can just grab that list that we are maintaining and use it to initialize or to change list picker. So every time we click on list picker, we will see the actual content of that list. So that's the quickest and easiest way for you to visualize the content of a list. Okay, so we'll go ahead and use this particular feature, which is called a list picker, or you can use list view, which is taking up more space on your screen. It's a visible component that allows to place a list of text elements in your screen to display. So this one takes up more space, because it's just showing you the entire content all the time. It will not work directly on screens that are scrollable because it takes up as much space as is needed. Okay, so I'll pick the first one, which is a list picker. Okay, just dash it over here and change the text. Now this text only affects how the list picker looks like before you click on it to select an item. Okay, so I'll just call this list content because it's going to show me the content of my number list. All right, so now we have to go back to blocks because every time we add an item to this list here, we have to remember to update that other item too. So we go to list picker, and then we say set list picker 1 dot elements to a particular list. Now if you just hover over this item here from somewhere else, it doesn't really show you the help text here. Okay, but what this does is it will basically take a list and use it to specify the content of this particular list picker. So whatever you use here for this notch here has to be a list. Now it just turns out that we already have a list that we're maintaining. We just have to say, oh, list picker use this updated list, as your, elements. Okay. Are we still doing okay so far with this program? Now that we have a list picker, so we can visualize the content of the list. We're not really doing anything with the selection, so you can click on it, and you can select an item. It just kind of throws it away. We're just using it to visualize what is in the list. So now is a good time to go back to the emulator and actually run it. Okay, so we'll have three, let's say three numbers. Okay, 5, and then we have 4, and then we have, let's say 7. Now we have 3 items on the list. How do we know that we actually have 3 items in the list? Well, we click list content here, and it shows me the 3 items. Now, in fact, this is a list picker, which means its job is not to show you what is in the list, but also allow you to select one of those items. So I can actually click on one. Let's say I click on the middle one. It doesn't do a single thing because I didn't specify what to do when something is picked from a list picker. But that's, because I haven't really specified what to do with it. Are there any questions with this particular application? Now this is potentially useful, especially for those of you who want to track something. If you want to track something, it usually means you're creating entries dynamically. Okay, it can be something that is either date and time based, it can be customers, it can be location. But the point is, the number of items that you want to track, that you want to store, is dynamic. It is arbitrary. Okay, it can be 1, can be 0, and then it can be 200. So this is a way for you to kind of keep track of all those items, because now you have a way to handle any number of something. Okay, using the concept of a list. And you also have a way using a list picker and say, I want to take a closer look on this particular item here. Okay, I want to take a look at this particular customer. Show me the details of this particular customer. This is your ticket to get that done. Okay. All right. Any questions at this point? No questions? Okay. So next, we'll take this list here and say, okay, let's do some processing with items in this list. Okay, let's do some processing based on all of the elements in this particular list. To be more specific, I want to do a summation. Okay, so I'm going to make another button here and say, okay, give me the sum of all the numbers in this list. Okay, that's what I'm going to do next. So I will go to the design screen here, designer screen, and pick a new button. And we'll change the button name to btn add, or sum, depending on how you want to do it. We'll just call it sum. And then change the text of the button to summation. And then we need one field or one label to reflect the actual result of the sum. So we'll drag a label down here. And we can change the label name to LBL sum. And then change the text in the label to be summation of all the numbers. Yep.
I was just wondering, is the audio on your recording?
I certainly hope so. Yes, it is. I thought I checked a little bit earlier, but it's always good to double check. All right. So now the elements are already here. We now have to go to blocks and say, okay, so what do we do when we are supposed to add up all the numbers? Well, first of all, let's specify how that action is triggered. It's going to be triggered when the btn sum, or the sum button, is clicked. Okay, so we drag this block here. And then the next thing we have to do is to go through each and every item and add it to the summation. There are 2 ways to do it. One is to use the text of that particular label, sum, to keep track of the summation. That's not really a good way to do it, because you're using the text property of something as if it is just a number. Usually not a very good idea. So it makes sense to use what we call a local variable to keep track of the sum, because after the calculation, that variable does not need to exist anymore. So it makes sense to make it a local variable instead of a global variable. So if you go to variables, you will start to see, okay, when we move down here, we have two blocks that are very similar, but they are slightly different. Both basically says initialize local whatever name to something else. So either one will give you the concept of using a local variable. The difference has to do with how it connects to everything else. At this point, we really haven't talked about the use of a subroutine or procedure or function, depending on your programming background. So it doesn't really make sense to use the second block. It only makes sense to use the first block. So this block is what we're going to use here. So we'll drag it and put it here. And now I'm going to declare a local variable that I call sum. Okay, so now you have to remember a local variable is local. Okay, but how local is a local variable? In most programming languages, that's like a big topic. You have to talk about what is the scope of a variable, which means where in this program can see this variable sum. But in App Inventor, it's easy. What is the scope of sum?
Just within that click action.
Yep, it's within this block here, right? Whatever other blocks you put in here, it has visibility of this particular local variable. So that's why App Inventor is kind of neat, because it visually shows you a lot of stuff that would otherwise require some explanation. But in here, it is so visual that's really not a whole lot of need to explain it. Now, because sum is a number, I go to math here and just put a 0 here. Okay. And now here comes the really, really bothersome part, is how do we go through each and every single thing in this list, the global variable list of numbers, and add them up. I mean, that seems like kind of like a hassle. Okay, in a regular programming language, you will have to go through a lot of overhead to get it done. But the App Inventor and many scripting languages, there's a shortcut to it. Okay, the shortcut is to go to Control here, and there is a particular way to do it very simply. Okay, so this block here, which is for each blah 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 in list, is giving you everything that you need in order to go through every single item in the list and do something with each item in the list, as the name implies. Okay. So if you look, read the text here, it runs the blocks in the do section for each item in the list. Use the given variable name to refer to the current list item. Okay, so let's go ahead and drag it here and change this item to a number. Okay. All right. So this block needs two things, and it's missing one thing right now. That little notch here is missing because it wants you to specify a list first. Okay, give me a list. Okay, and I will do the following to each item of the list. So you have to supply a list first, and that list turns out to be our global variable list of numbers. So we go to variables, and then we go to get. And if we specify, now this is the cool part of App Inventor too, is it's aware of all the variables that you have defined up to this point, both local and also global. Okay, so when you use the get block and use the drop-down box, it shows you all the possible choices. You cannot possibly choose something that is wrong, that is inaccessible. Okay? So in this case, we do want the global variable list of numbers, because that really is a list. The other one is my local variable to keep track of the running sum. So what do I want to do with each item that is now called a number from the from this list here? And it has to do with sum, right? Because otherwise I would not be defining the local variable sum. Well, maybe I just want to add it to sum. Okay, I take each item from the list and I say, okay, what is your value? I want to add you to the local variable sum. Now, to do that, in most other languages, it's easy. Especially in C, it would be spelled like sum plus equal to a number. Okay, that's all you need to do, because in C and C++, there's an operator called a compound assignment operator, where you can combine the calculation of something and the assignment into one single thing, which is really kind of handy. But in App Inventor, you have to do it the long way and drag and drop things too. Okay, so there's no easy way to type this out. You actually have to drag and drop. So first of all, you say set. The outermost block is a set because that's the last thing you want to do. Okay, and this is also where things is a little bit counterintuitive, because as graphical and user-friendly as App Inventor is, when you're constructing blocks, you are actually thinking sometimes in the opposite way. Like in this case here, I'm thinking in the opposite way because I have to specify the last operation first, because it's the outermost block. Because eventually I want to update something, so I have to use a set block first. So in this case, I am eventually going to change the value of sum. But what am I going to use to update the value of sum? Oh, it's the result of a calculation. Okay, in fact, the calculation is just an addition, so we'll drag and drop an addition operation here. One of the item of the addition is just sum itself, because I'm just increasing the sum by a certain amount with each iteration. So in this case, it would be a get block using sum as my local variable. And then the other one is another variable. So I'm going to use get again. And that one is going to be a number, because a number is reflecting whatever item that I'm traversing, whatever item that I'm visiting for this particular iteration of the loop. And that would do it. Okay, this is going to do. Let me specify which part here. This block will do it. Okay, it will go through each and every single item in the global variable list of numbers, and then with each number that it encounters in the list, it will add it to the sum. Now, in this case, you also have to kind of be aware of this loop here will go from first to last. Okay, in other words, it will traverse the list according to the item sequencing or the item ordering in the list. It doesn't go like randomly or go all over the place. It just goes sequentially. First item first, second item, third item, and so on. Okay, which can come in handy depending on what you're doing. All right, so now that we have done the calculation, after the for each block, it is time to reflect the value of the sum using the label. So once again, when we think about it, we say, oh, take this number and use it to update the text of label 1. But when we specify the blocks, we have to think in a reverse order, right? We think about the last operation first. So we have to think about, oh, okay, we want to eventually update label sum, so we have to pick set label sum text first, and then we specify what we want to set it to. That turns out to be the value of my local variable sum. That's it. So are there any questions about the construction of this particular block? It's a little bit more complex than the usual one, because it has what we call a control structure. The for each block is called a control structure because it is not just flowing through just sequentially. Step 1, step 2, step 3, we're done. Okay? It actually has an element that allows you to go back, like do this over and over again until we run out of items in the list to process. But in this case, it's a very handy feature. Yep.
Using that last set label sum in an orange block, so you're not doing it every time.
Oh, you're right.
So it's going to ask you.
This will be interesting because it will update the screen like that. So I should take this out and put it after the for each block. Yep. Thank you. So this way it won't update the screen all the time. Instead, it will do the calculation all first, and then it will reflect the value of the sum. Thank you. All right, so the app should be updated by now because remember it has a constant communication with the programming environment. So now we switch back to the emulator. Oh
Nice.
No, it crashed. Okay, that's okay. We'll just go ahead and reset connection, which actually kills the emulator. Go ahead and start it over again. When you're home, and you have your desktop and your Android device connected to the same subnet, like the same router, it's probably better to use the other ways of making the connection. I'm still debating whether to spend $50 to get a router.
Yeah, I use a software called software data cable, so I don't have to actually physically plug it in. And then I basically using the Explorer, the Thunder or Nautilus, I just type in the FTP address that it gives me, and I can copy things from the desktop over to there, which works nicely.
Okay. Well, since you were waiting, let me kind of talk about something that is kind of related to this class, maybe not of importance at this point, but it will be important later on. The question is, well, since this class has a lab component, it's online, how are we doing that? Okay. Well, unless you want to, I cannot go to your place and actually look at how you write your program, in order to answer your question. So there are several things you can do. The easiest one is a screenshot. Okay. So whenever you have a question like, I really don't know what to do with this screen, or I'm getting this error message and I don't know what to do with it. A screenshot is okay. You just, I think is it control print screen on a keyboard, okay, and that will take the snapshot and put it into the clipboard, and then you can use a tool to put that content into a file, send me the PNG file or GIF or whatever. Then I can see what you're talking about. Okay, that's one way to do it. But it's better if you can do a screen recording, kind of like what I'm doing here. If you don't like if you don't feel like talking and recording at the same time, you can just leave the voice out of it. But a screenshot is static. Okay, I can see that particular screen, but I cannot see what led to that particular screen. If you do a screen recording of, let's say, just 30 seconds, that's really helpful because I can see what steps you were taking in order to get to that particular screen. How many people know how to do a little screen recording, like a 30 seconds segment? It doesn't have to be long. Okay, very good. Worst come to worst, you can always have a webcam or your phone to kind of take a picture or record your screen as a video.
How you do it?
Huh?
Why don't you walk us through how you do it?
Well, you have to get Linux first, right? There are easy ways to do it. I'm going to get to that part, but first, we'll go ahead and kind of play with this app first. Now, when I reloaded the app, everything would have forgotten because nothing is persistent. Global variables are not persistent. When you shut down your application, when you reset your mobile device, the content of global variables will be gone. Okay, so that's why we need to talk about TinyDB eventually, because most applications or most of the project proposals involve storing something on the device that is persistent. Okay, but just getting back to this program, we'll have 5 and 4 and say 7, so the same 3 numbers. We'll use this list picker to take a look at the list first. Okay, 5, 4, 7. Okay, that's good. Good to double check. And now we click summation to add up 5, 4, and 7. They should add up to 16. Okay, so sum should update to 16 after I click this button here, and it does. Okay, so the program does what it's supposed to do. It's a very simple program to make use of a list, but at least it kind of shows you what you can do with the list, just kind of on the surface also. Okay, so getting back to taking screenshots, I know I'm kind of digressing a little bit here, but I do think I think that's an important topic, so we'll go over that one too. I'm bringing you to a class that you should be in already, which is technical resource or tax students, all students. I think it's in this one. Let me see. No. Record my desktop. Oh, it is this one. Okay, so there's 3 resources you can use for taking screencasts. The first one is called Screencast-O-Matic. So if you click on this one, it brings you to a link, which is here. And it's basically cloud-based. It's a web application, but I think it does not work in Linux. Okay, it doesn't say that it works in Linux. It works in Windows and also Mac OS X. It's free. Okay, you can sign up for a free account, and I was told that you have up to 15 minutes of free stuff. Okay, but it was not made clear to me whether each clip can be up to 15 minutes or you have a total of 15 minutes of stuff that you can store, in the cloud storage over there. But for the purpose of doing, assignments for this class, 15 minutes is pretty long. I mean, if you just want to send me like a 30-second clip to show me, okay, I ran into this problem by following these steps. That's like, a minute or 30-second kind of clip. 15 minutes is plenty. I was told that this is an easy application to use because it's web-based. You don't have to store anything locally on your hard drive. Everything that you do is automatically, uploaded to the remote site. I have not used it myself because it doesn't work in Linux. But it is one quick and easy way. There's nothing for you to install locally, as far as I can tell. But I am very, I just have this itch to click start recording, even though it says, for Windows and Mac.
Crashes?
Good thing I'm not in a bomb squad.
Yes.
I just want to click that button. I just have that itch. Okay, it uses a Java plugin, so it might actually work.
If it rejects that account, sometimes if they reject something, you change the user agent.
Oh, okay.
It allows it for some reason.
Well, with certain plugins, I can actually do normal things that a normal PC can do, with the browser. And I think this particular distribution has some of those plugins already installed. This doesn't seem like it's working. It might have something to do with Privacy Badger too, which is like stopping, some of the content. So let me turn this off first and see if it helps. Well, all it did is to turn on the advertisement on the other side. Yeah, I guess not. All right. But on a PC, on a regular PC with Java installed, I'm assuming it will start up, a Java applet, that will do the screen recording and upload it directly. Okay, so this is one resource. For Linux stuff, you can use Record My Desktop. That's a Linux, type of application. It's not difficult to install. It works. I've used it before. The last one is CRUD, and okay, this is it's open source. Okay, so this one is an open source project. The CRUD it's a screencast tool that is written in Java. So once again, it's a Java applet. It is well suited for making video tutorials on most platforms because Java runs equally slow on all computers. CRUD records movie files, including sound of selected parts of your screen. The files use the QuickTime Move format, MOV format. The program has an intuitive and compact user interface. I have not used it myself. Okay, so you're more than welcome to give it a try, see if it works. The question is, once you have recorded your video, what are you gonna do with it, right? Because you can, I don't want you to send me like a 150 megabyte file, okay, with your clip. So what you want to do is to upload it to something like YouTube, okay, and just give me a link to your uploaded video on YouTube. Then I can watch it on YouTube. Okay, it's useful because YouTube I think gives you up to 15 minutes of recording per clip, and there's no number of how many clips you can upload, each one being up to 15 minutes. If you have been an outstanding member like myself with YouTube, it will allow you to upload basically 4 hours of content for each clip and unlimited number of clips. Okay, so if you have never been caught, copying stuff that is copyrighted and stuff like that, you have a clean record. Eventually, they will give you the ability to upload, longer, video clips. But getting back to the reason of doing all this stuff, it's easier for me, if I can see what you did to get to a certain point, like, okay, I got this runtime error and I have no idea why it's giving me this runtime error. This is much better than just giving me a screenshot of what the runtime error is, because at least I will have some context of knowing, oh, okay, I can see that you were doing this, oh, okay, freeze frame here, okay, I think that might be the problem, okay. Are there any questions about, taking screenshots or screen recording for the purpose of the quote-unquote online, lab portion in this class?
Switching it to IE8 in the Chrome browser.
Okay.
IE9 crashes.
Thank you. Excellent. All right. So we have just gone through most of the topic of list. The rest of this is really just to how to write the kind of lengthy app to do what you can do with a list. So we're not going to go too far with this part here. I'm going to switch back to the notes here. and start with persistent tracking using TinyDB, because that really is the one part that I want to get to, because most of your projects, or the way that you propose a project, require tracking something, and it has a arbitrary number of items to track. Okay, so with this one here, it starts with a brief description of what TinyDB is. So TinyDB is what we call a key value persistent database. Okay, to call it a database is really stretching it. Okay, but I cannot not call it a database, because that's what DB stands for in TinyDB. Okay, but what it really is it's storing what we call key value pairs in a persistent way. Now, when we talk about the key value pair, all it really means is, in order to store something, which is the value part, you associate a key to it. Okay, so whenever you want to retrieve that item, you tell TinyDB and say, okay, here's the item that I want to retrieve. That would be the key, and then TinyDB will give you the value associated with that key. Is that okay so far? And that's it. That really is what TinyDB can do. Is it will store things, and every time you want to store something, you have to give it two things. You have to say, okay, here's the tag that I can use an ID for this particular item, and here's the item. But that item can be a single number, it can be a string, it can be a list. Okay, so it's nice that you can store an entire list as a single item in TinyDB. Okay, because later on you will see why it is so useful. But that's basically the whole essence of TinyDB. Unlike other databases, okay, some of you may have used a SQL database before, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL, Oracle, and so on. Those are called relational databases, where you can have like a query like this long, okay, and very complicated, and you can do all sorts of fancy stuff. Can't do that with TinyDB. So do not expect TinyDB to be a relational database and say, oh, I want to do all of these little fancy stuff with it. Can't do it. This is the only thing it can do. Okay, give it a key, give it a value, it will store. And then give it a key again later on, it can retrieve the item or update it. That's all it can do. All right, so now that we know what TinyDB is, we'll move on to the concept of tracking something. When you track something, some people use a log. A log is basically a list of entries that is usually entered based on a chronological order. For instance, if I want to keep track of, I don't want to give away things that you guys are doing with your projects, so I'm going to say, let's say I want to track clinching, okay? Because my dentist said that, well, you have some clear signs that you clinch a lot, okay? So I want to kind of keep track of that. If I want to keep track of that, then every time I notice myself you're clinching, or every time you guys see that I'm clinching, you'd say, oh, Tack, you're clinching. Then I would go to my app and say, okay, I'm clinching. Ding, okay, maybe a single button to say that, okay, I just noticed that I clinched. Okay, so I can keep track of the frequency and what time, when it happens the most often, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's logging. Okay, it's just saying, okay, here's a little entry and says, okay, something happened at this time. Tracking in some of your applications can also involve maintaining the data or information related to, say, customers, locations, expenses, bills and whatnot. Okay, so there are a lot of things that you can track, but all of these things share one thing. Okay, there's one thing that is common to all of these things that you're tracking. The number of entries cannot be determined prior to the running of the application. Okay? In other words, it doesn't make any sense to say that you can only keep track of 5 customers. Okay? Why 5? Why not more? Why not less? Okay? Or I can only keep track of 16 locations of something. Okay? What if I want to log the 17th location? Do I lose the first one? Okay? Do I overwrite one of the items? It doesn't make any sense to have that particular limitation. So now the main issue is we have to be able to store, somehow we have to be able to store any arbitrary number of items into TinyDB. So you cannot just say that I have a key, customer 1 is a key, and here's the data of customer 1. Customer 2 as a key will associate with customer 2, because if you do it this way, you can only go to a certain number. Okay, So now we need a mechanism to store any arbitrary number of things. So here's solution one. Solution one is to use an arbitrary number of key value pairs in your TinyDB. And I'm just going to point out the important part here. I'm not going to read the entire thing. So the key is to determine how to generate a unique key for each item that you want to store. That really is the most important part. Okay, I was about to say that's the key part, but that would be kind of like overusing the word key. Okay, so how do you generate a key in order to make a dynamic key value pair so that the keys of different items cannot collide, they cannot be the same? Well, if you're dealing with something that is time-based, well, maybe the time itself can be used. In other words, you use the year, month, day of month, and then hour, minute, second, okay, to be the key. That's perfect, that's okay as a key in TinyDB. Okay, so unless you expect that you might be storing multiple items, within a second, you won't run into a problem. Especially with a single user application, you're only using one particular device. It is on the device itself. You should not have any problem. If you're tracking customers, on the other hand, it becomes somewhat of an issue. Okay, if you're dealing with customers or people in general, using the first and last name may not be the best thing to do, because there are ways, there are times when you have two people who have the same exact first name and the same exact last name. So what are you gonna do, right? And I don't like the way that the school, handles that kind of thing here. Smith, in this case it was Smith T1, Smith T2. But when you look at the key Smith T1 and Smith T2, which one is which one? It doesn't really, it's not clear. So in the case of customers, there are a few things they can rely on that has to be unique. One would be the email address. Okay, if you want to keep track of email address of your customers, that usually is unique. I mean, otherwise it will be the same customer, right? Social security number, yes, it is unique, but you probably don't want to store that on the mobile device, especially if it's not encrypted, it's just in plain text. Other things that might be unique would be a customer ID. Okay, if you already have a system to assign customer IDs, that will be another thing you can use as for the key of a key pair value. Okay. Okay. The other thing, so one thing is to use basically dynamically generate the key of a key value pair and then be able to store basically any number of pairs within TinyDB. That's one way to do it. There's another way to do it. The other way to do it is to use a list in your program, and the list itself is a key value pair list. Okay, so when you store that one single list into TinyDB, you are effectively storing a number of items, any arbitrary number of items into TinyDB. So instead of using TinyDB to keep track of the multiple items, you use your own code to deal with the multiple items. It sounds harder than it is, because in App Inventor, if you go to lists here, it actually has some built-in feature to allow you to use a key to retrieve items. So I'm just going to give you this item here, this block here. Look up in pairs, and you supply the key, and you supply a list of pairs, and it can help you retrieve the value associated with the key in the list of key value pairs. Okay, I know that's a long sentence, but I'm pretty sure I used all the right terms in this particular case. So in this particular thing, what you do is you use your own list to keep track of key value pairs. And if you do it, in a consistent way, then you can use this block here to help you retrieve the value based on the key of a pair. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any other support other than this block here. Storing is not an issue. Storing is a simple issue of adding an item to a list, and then the item that you're adding is by itself a list with two entries. The first entry is the key, the second entry is the value. So storing is not an issue, retrieving is not an issue, deleting or updating is an issue. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. Okay, but I'm just going to show you, what you can do, currently with the stuff that is already in App Inventor. Okay, and we'll move on here. Now the important part is Solution 2 is not exclusive to Solution 1, so you can kind of have a combination of the two if you want to. This section here talks about, the kind of like an advanced topic, so I would not do it unless you are really, really comfortable with TinyDB and how to handle a list and stuff like that. So I'm going to give you an example of using a parking violation app. Okay, so let's say that somebody wants to keep track of all the parking violation, and just basically as a tracking application. So in this case, each individual item is a parking violation. But what type of information do you want to store with a parking violation? There are many, many different pieces, right? There's a date, time, vehicle VIN, vehicle license number, the file name of the picture that you have taken, and also the GPS location, and so on. Okay. Okay, great. I can make a list with all of these items, so I can look at the entire violation as if it is just a single item. That's easy. Okay, not a problem. The question is, what are we going to use as a key to store this particular item? You can use the date and the time. Okay, that's not a problem. But the problem is sometimes you may not want to retrieve the items based on just the date and the time. Maybe sometimes someone will give you a license plate number, and you have to retrieve that particular entry based on the license plate number. Well, you can still do it. You can kind of sequentially go through all the items and then search for the one that has the license plate number that you're trying to track. What about based on vehicle make and model? Okay. What about the color? Okay. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you might want to search. You use as a search criteria, and it's not easy to go through all of the entries to sequentially search. So what you can do is what most real databases do when it comes to generating the key of a table. Okay, a table is kind of like a TinyDB thing, but it's not exactly the same. But the point is, the key of a key value pair is nothing more than a sequential number. It starts with 1 or 0, depending on the database or depending on how you initialize it, and then the ID of the next item is just one more than the last number assigned. Okay, it's just taking the next number, taking the next number, taking the next number. Even when items are deleted, you don't reuse those numbers. You just keep on taking new numbers. Okay, so yes, eventually you will run out of numbers, but even with 32 bits, which is a common number that we use, for integers on computers, it will run up to 4 billion. Okay, so by the time you issue, 4 billion, parking violations, yes, you might have a problem of getting it back to 0. Okay, but that will take a while. So that's how most real databases do. Is to just keep track of the last sequential number assigned, and then you just keep taking the next number, add 1 to the sequential number, add 1 to the sequential number. So that means the key that you use with the key pair value has nothing to do with whatever you're storing. And then how do you search things? How do you search based on the search criteria? So in those cases, you use what we call an index. An index is nothing more than its own list. It's based on the criteria itself and a sequential number to locate the actual record. Okay, if you're not quite getting what I'm saying here, that's okay. It's not a problem. Because this is not a database class. I just want to give those of you who want to use a more advanced approach to kind of understand that you can do something like that. So what an index is it is by itself. Each index is a tiny DB entry, and the value of a index is itself a list of key value pairs, and in each key value pair inside this list here consists of a key that is field specific. So in this case, it can be the VIN, can be the license number, can be the color, can be the make, can be the model, can be the year of the vehicle, and so on. And then that will be the key. And then the value is the sequential number of the corresponding item in the main store part, when you retrieve the actual parking violation. So that will be the key of that one becomes the value of this one. If you already understand database concepts, it's basically the foreign key to a different table. Okay, to use database terminology. If you're not quite getting what I'm talking about, what is a foreign key and whatnot, don't worry. Okay, this is not something that you have to use. I'm just giving those of you who want to use this tool, an extra resource that you can use. Right. So I'm gonna go through one more thing here. There are limitations to use TinyDB. After all, it is not a relational database. It is just a flat file that you're storing on the device itself. So when you have to store a lot of items, it becomes inefficient. Okay, it's just going to be slow. It's hard to retrieve items and so on and so forth. And then the second limitation is it is on your device. Okay, it's not a web resource. So there's no easy way for you to share the information, even if you want to, with another device running the same application. Okay. In other words, if I install an app using a TinyDB on device A, and I install the same application on device B, the TinyDB of these two applications or these two installations have nothing to do with each other. Okay. Even if you want to share that information, you will have to go through a lot of steps in order to share the information from these two individual TinyDBs on two different devices. So that's another limitation. Some of the project proposals involve, it only makes sense when the app is installed on many devices and have multiple users. So in those cases, you want the information to be shared by something other than the on-device storage, something other than a TinyDB. So for those particular project proposals, you will have to look into using a remote database. I would suggest going through the web interface to make the connections instead of making a dedicated connection to a database, simply because the web interface is easier to debug. Okay, because you can just use a web browser, type in your URL, get the result back, and go, oh, okay, I can see it's working. So maybe my app should be working as well. But in that case, you will run into some additional issues. The first one is you will need some expertise in web scripting. I can give you some basic stuff, as far as PHP or Perl scripts are concerned. So I can give you some basic stuff. You will also have to think about security. In other words, it's no longer something that is on the device itself. It is on the web. Okay. So if you do not have any type of secure authentication, any means to do authentication in a secure way, then you can potentially have an issue, because other people can go to the same website and they can just kind of poke around, using different types of URLs until they can get into a database. I mean, there are tricks that people can use to kind of really see what your database can do. So you will run into those particular issues of security concerns. How do you maintain multiple user accounts and so on and so forth? But it does give you the ability to have one single database, and different applications can connect to the same database so that users of the same application can in a way communicate with each other. So it opens up a lot of possibilities, but the complexity is also increased accordingly. So if you guys are interested, we can talk about this in more details in this class. But if you're not interested and your application for this project or for this class can, if you want to limit the scope to only run on a single app on a single device, that's okay with me. Okay, if you want to push it a little bit, we can talk about those topics. So the people who really want to get this going, I can show you a few tricks of getting it working. We are running out of time today. I'll see you guys next Monday. Okay, not Wednesday. I won't be here on Wednesday because of an event that I have to go to. So we're canceling class on Wednesday. I'll see you guys next Monday instead. So have a nice weekend. Yes, feels kind of weird to say have a nice weekend on a Monday. Maybe I'll just do some recording so I can
Means I get
give
to
you guys
come
some
on
stuff.
Wednesday.